as the magic bullet theory. This one bullet enters Kennedy's back, exits his throat, enters Connolly's back, breaks a rib, bouncing off it, exiting his chest, then enters his forearm, exits his wrist, and lodges in his thigh.
Of course, the bullet has to do a lot of work. I mean, you can see from this sideways angle that it's coming down at maybe 45 degrees and then going back up at another angle and then turning back down and coming out to the right and left as it does. And, you know, it's got to go through Kennedy, it's got to shatter a rib and a wrist and end up in Connolly's thigh. And it's got to do this all, as bullets travel fairly fast, it's got to do this all in a fairly short period of time. Part of the problem that the commission had with this theory was the timing. But just to look again at the angle, this is a drawing from the top of what the bullet has to do. But as Walter Cronkite said, these were no ordinary circumstances. He was firing at the President of the United States, and thereby the laws of physics suspend themselves. Because this is the actual position of the two people in relation to each other and the angles that would be necessary. This bullet's got more work to do. It doesn't even end up in his thigh. It ends up on a stretcher on the second floor of Parkland Hospital after Jack Ruby goes by and kicks it. And it's taken down to the FBI, who decide that this one bullet, the only one that they can find, that they can link at all ballistically to the Mannlicher Carcano, must have been the one that did the same damage.
And this shows Connolly's body, and the angle, that the real steep angle is the angle that would have had to have been to cause those wounds. So Kennedy would have had to have been a giant.
Yeah, or there must have been a second shot. The problem with two shots creating this situation are that the Warren Commission had evidence of all these wounds, but from the window with one gun and one person firing, and with that Mannlicher Carcano, which needs to be cycled. Shell has to be ejected, bolt pulled back, bolt put back into place, and then aiming and firing. Just the bolt action part of that sequence to cycle in the next shell takes 2.3 seconds for the best weapons experts the Warren Commission could find. The timing of the shooting, because they're forced to conclude that Kennedy couldn't have been hit before a certain point in the Zapruder film, and they know that the Zapruder film proceeds at a certain number of frames per second, and so by counting those frames out until the point when Kennedy's headshot happens, they have just a little over 6 seconds in order to do all this damage. If you're cycling the gun and it takes you 2.3 seconds in between each cycle, then you can barely get off 3 bullets within that time period. And those 3 bullets are probably going to take you longer than 6 seconds, but Oswald didn't need time to aim either, so he just cycled it and shot it, and there they went. But one of those bullets has to deal with a bystander who was actually interviewed, and they believed, there were others that said so, but he included in the official report Mr. Tague, who said he was wounded over there on the sidewalk on the south side of Elm Street. So that's got to be at least one bullet.
And then you have Kennedy's
Fatal bullet to the head, at least one. So you've only got one bullet left, and so that's what has to do this work. But even if Oswald could have used more bullets, he didn't have time to fire them because the period of time, even if you stretch it as far as the Warren Commission does, by saying that Connolly had a delayed reaction to being hit, the bullet still at best is 1.5 to 2 seconds in time to do all this damage, which is not really, it's a pretty slow bullet. Of course, doing all that turning and yawing, I suppose might have had to stop for a minute, think about it, but you know, it's pretty slow for something that goes about 17,000 feet per second, and it's coming through flesh and slowing down a little bit, but that's a long time for it to take, and and yet this gun couldn't possibly have fired another bullet within a 1.2 second or 2-second period at all. And so it can't be 2 bullets by one part of their theory, and it can't be 2 bullets by the count, but then that leaves us with the magic bullet, which we'll see in a minute here, to do the damage.
And that's not all. The bullet, this is the Pristine magic bullet, rotated and photographed from 3 views. The bullet is so undamaged that there's more metal removed from Connolly than is missing from the magic bullet. And also more metal still remaining in Connolly than missing from the magic bullet.
Can you go back a second? At the top, you'll see what appears to be damage to the bullet. Actually, that's a metal that was cut out for neutron analysis by the FBI. So even that little damage to the bullet is only done later. There's almost no flattening or distortion of the bullet, and this is Commission Exhibit 399.
Tests shooting similar bullets through a cadaver's wrist were done to prove that a bullet could be in that pristine condition, but just with the one wound through a wrist, these are the resulting test bullets. And an X-ray of Connolly's thigh.
Showing metal remaining in the thigh that also had to have come from the bullet, but can't be accounted for by weight.
And his wrist. And this is the close-up of the graphic that I produced with artist Bill Baker, showing that magic bullet path and the test results. A little better drawing than the government's drawing.
This is a picture from the Warren Commission showing a slight problem that Oswald would have had looking out the window at the Kennedy motorcade. There was a tree in the way. If Oswald had any sense shooting from that position, had he been shooting from that position, or anybody up there that wanted to hit Kennedy, they would have hit him as he approached the window along Houston, directly underneath them, rather than waiting for him to turn and go away on Elm Street and pass underneath all these trees. So the earliest point at which Oswald can get a shot off to hit Kennedy is about frame 210 of the Zapruder film, and it's at a point when Kennedy isn't visible to the eye in the film. He's also he's sort of disappeared from Zapruder's film view behind a roadway sign. Many of the researchers feel that he may have been hit slightly earlier. Some say as early as frame 185. Talking about 18 frames per second, so this is a matter of gradations of seconds. But one of the most amusing theories to me is that some of the people who defend the Warren Commission attempt to explain the angles of the magic bullet path with the idea that although Kennedy and Connolly are in the same relative position as they disappear behind the sign and emerge from the sign, that in the meantime they both shifted sufficiently to allow the bullet to pass directly through them in a straight line. But these are some of the many twists that they have to do. And by timing the first shot at frame 210, they only have the remaining frames out to number 313, the fatal headshot, that short little, about little over 6-second period to get all the shots in from this one location.
So bystander James Tague is wounded by 1 shot. The second shot causes 7 wounds. And the third shot, the fatal headshot, also has conflicting information. Parkland Hospital in Dallas documented a massive exit wound at the back of the head with part of the skull missing, and performed a tracheostomy across the throat wound, documenting an entrance wound at Kennedy's throat. And the back wound was not noticed, examined, or documented. He's flown to Bethesda Naval Hospital, where the official autopsy documents a major exit wound at the front, at the right temple, and a back wound short in depth, 1 to 2 inches, with no point of exit and no bullet. And the throat wound was not examined because the autopsy doctors didn't know about it yet. Later that the following day, there's a conversation with the Parkland doctors, and they find out about the throat wound. So there's a second revised official autopsy report, which locates the back wound several inches higher and claims the bullet exited through JFK's throat and then proceeded through Connolly. And the early autopsy notes were destroyed. This is a representation of the rear part of the Kennedy's head by the doctors at Parkland Hospital. All the doctors, Dr. Perry, Dr. Clark, the neurosurgeon, Dr. McClelland, and Dr. Carrico, who inserted the tube into Kennedy's throat, say that the back of the skull and part of the occipital bone, which is the bone at the very back, were missing, and that there was a huge gaping hole at the back and an entrance wound at the front.
Nurses there too also give similar accounts of what the nature of the wound was, and many of the doctors there gave a press conference later on in the day and were asked about, at one point, the official story of Oswald firing up from this window, and one of the doctors having looked at the wounds and knowing about the neck wound, had to posit that Kennedy had turned entirely around in his seat so that he could be hit into the throat by someone firing from behind him.
Deputy Sheriff Weitzman, who was in Dealey Plaza, found a large piece of skull 10 to 15 feet to the left rear of the motorcade. The next day, a student found a piece of bone 25 feet to the south rear of the car, and it was identified as a piece of human skull and a piece of occipital bone. Officer Hargis was riding directly behind Kennedy to his left rear, was hit with brain and blood matter at 100 miles per hour. He was hit with such force that he was knocked off his motorcycle and thought he had been hit with gunfire. Officer James Cheney, the motorcycle to the right rear, saw JFK struck in the head by the final bullet. Marilyn Steitzman, Zapruder's receptionist, said the shot hit Kennedy between the ear and the eye at the front from the front. Now on and on, testimony from witnesses who say that they saw him be hit from the front.
Are you ready to go? This is Ida Docks for the House Select Committee attempting to support yet again the conclusions of the Warren Commission and the Bethesda autopsy in her drawing showing a bullet entering the back of the skull and exiting at the front near the top of the head. This doesn't show the damage it would have done, but merely the direction.
And even the official autopsy doctor in Bethesda, Dr. Hume, had problems with this drawing. He said he didn't see a hole in the back of the head. You see the hole documented there, and this is an autopsy drawing. The House Select Committee didn't use the autopsy photos because they thought they were too harsh. They had an artist draw the official photos. And here an autopsy photo.
Essentially the same one, and it appears to show the flap of bone on the right side above the ear, with the back of the head almost fully intact, and at least some of the critics suggest that looking closely at this photo, you can see a matting line as if a little toupee has been put on the back of Kennedy's head to cover over the area where the occipital bone had been blown out, and to cover it up. Just along about the center of the head there, curving up to the right above the ear, they suggest that the hair looks completely different than the hair in the photograph below it, and that a cutting line is visible at that point.
And another autopsy photo.
This one again not seeming to match much of the evidence. And there's questions about these photos, whether they were doctored even from the person that we got them from. and it's hard even looking at these photos one at a time next to each other to see how they represent the same wounds or head in the situation. But it's clear that tremendous damage was done to Kennedy's head, and in a few of the photos can you see the back of the head in any clear way to indicate what this shot did. But it is clear that the brain matter and blood blew out to the back left of the car. Did you have another for that? Okay. And the photo here in the Washington Post shows Clint Hill climbing up onto the back of the car, and Jackie Kennedy, who has attempted to climb out onto the back of the limousine. It took 8 years to get testimony released from her about what she was doing in a position, I'm sure, of some shock and fear, probably. She responded by climbing out of the back of the car in order to get a section of Kennedy's skull and his head that she could see resting on the back of the limousine. And she reached out, picked that up, was pushed back in by Clint Hill, and held on to that piece of skull until she got all the way to Parkland Hospital, at which point she handed it to one of the medical aides there. What we show now is a sequence of some of the slides in the Zapruder film before showing you the film in full motion, again in a slow motion version. This is about frame 185 of the Zapruder film. Kennedy's not yet in a position to be hit by anyone on the 6th floor window, although the shot to the back could have originated around this time. He doesn't appear yet to be reacting to a shot to the back. He appears to still be waving, and just right after this frame he disappears from view behind this Stemmons roadway sign that was between him and Zapruder filming him up on the concrete pergola. And Kennedy apparently not hit by this point, and Connolly neither. So this is probably just before the shots begin to ring out in Dealey Plaza. This is jumping forward to about frame 312 with Connolly in his wife's arms, Jackie holding on to John F. Kennedy. This is just a fraction of a second before the fatal headshot hits. The next frame on 313. And obviously the shot does tremendous damage, blowing a halo of blood around his head, fragments of the brain and matter beginning to push outward from his head. In the next shot, which is about 3:15, you can see this damage to the right side of the head that I think was caused by a bullet coming in at the temple, cracking the skull open at that point between his ear and his eye, and opening up the head. The back of his head at this point seems to be pushed out by the exit wound that's described by the Parkland doctors, and there's still pieces of the brain matter exploding outward. Some of the critics feel that the bullet went into his head was not only a large caliber, but an exploding shell that would have also driven matter in several directions. But the bulk of the brain matter, as all the evidence suggests, went back and to the left over the rear of the car. And this is, again, maybe about frame 317, all within the space of a second. Kennedy clearly reacting by being lifted upwards and going back and to the left in the car, and you'll see that more clearly in the film, and the damage to his head fairly clear at that point.
Slides off now. We'll show you a version of the Zapruder film again in slower motion.
This particular footage doesn't have any sound. Zapruder's filming the turn of the motorcycles onto Elm Street. This is slow motion. They're approaching the Stemmons sign. You see
There's the umbrella.
to the lower left. Here's Kennedy slumping forward, and the reaction to the shot, Jackie climbs onto the car, reaching for the brain matter, and Clint Hill comes up. This next one has a little bit more of a blow-up. Kennedy waving. You'll see the umbrella clearly at the bottom left
as they emerge.
Kennedy hit, Connolly now hit, and reacting, but still holding on to his hat. And the fatal headshot.
This is a photo taken by Phil Willis from the south side of Elm Street. He said he took it at the first shot because the shot caused his finger to push the trigger.
You can see several interesting things in this photo. You can see the Stemmons roadway sign, and if you look closely just above the shoulder of the individual that's in the way, you can see the umbrella hoisted up there by the individual that's standing in that area. He put this umbrella up just before the shots began, seemed to pump it up and down and turn it, and then folded the umbrella up as soon as the shooting sequence was finished and walked back in the other direction away from all the rest of the witnesses. You can also see behind the Stemmons sign and to the left of it a retaining wall, concrete retaining wall. It's part of the pergola there. On the other side of that wall is a little bit of grass and the steps coming up to the grassy knoll. Beyond that wall, the picket fence, and that whole area up in there is what's considered the grassy knoll by the critics and the source of some of the shots. Mr. Grodin, we talked about before, the photo expert. I'm sorry, I was pointing at the thing. The photo expert believes that there's individuals, including one of the gunmen, standing at the end of that wall. And in this photo, there appear to be, and in other photos, people standing up in that area. One of the people who attempted to approach that area was afterwards was approached by someone claiming to be Secret Service, and there were no Secret Service assigned to that area, and they were told to clear it. Also, to the right of the Stemmons Freeway sign, you can see in this picture Zapruder and his secretary standing on the little concrete abutment next to the little center area of the pergola there, and that's where he's filming from as the motorcade approaches. And the car you see most prominently is the Secret Service car behind Connolly and Kennedy. This is yet a photo of several people that were arrested in Dealey Plaza. There were a total of 12 arrests made that day, and none of them even given so much attention as to enter their names or book them or take fingerprints. They were just released down at the Dallas jail as soon as Oswald was under arrest. But they were held for that time, and I think they were basically cleared from the area. This particular group of people are referred to in the research as the tramps, or bums. There's three of them. You can't see the third one very well. The tall tramp to the front has been alternately identified as Charles Harrelson or Fred Lee Chrisman, or in some versions as Frank Sturgis, the Watergate burglar. I don't ascribe to any of those theories particularly, but I think these people are not actually tramps. I think their clothes are in fairly good shape. They've got pretty good shoes, and although they're unshaven, their hair's messed a little bit. They were taken out of a boxcar just a little south of the overpass just after the shooting. A train moved through the area during the period of the shooting, and right afterwards it would have allowed people up in the Grassy Knoll area to run onto the train. They were taken out and moved. Fletcher Prouty, a researcher that I've done some work with, suggests that the individual walking the other direction at their side with his back to you is in fact top-ranking psychological warfare expert for the CIA, General Edwin Lansdale, who employed Daniel Ellsberg and Fletcher Prouty at different points historically and who they knew very well. And he says he recognizes that as Lansdale in Dealey Plaza, somebody who worked with Nelson Rockefeller and others. But these people identify also in part with the assassination of Martin Luther King. The second so-called tramp that you see there, referred to by most researchers as Frenchie, it's the nickname that he's given, matches the physical description given by the witnesses in the rooming house of the individual that ran from the area at the time of the shooting of Martin Luther King. He doesn't look a bit like James Earl Ray, the patsy in the case, but the police drawing in the New York Times from the witnesses at the King site matches this individual, and this isn't the only photo of him, but it matches his face very closely and fits the physical description there. And so this is if not one of the actual hit teams, at least one of the teams working in Dealey Plaza on the assassination in the view of most of the researchers.
And as a piece of visual evidence, it's interesting to note that they all appear to be strolling. Understand that the President of the United States has just been shot. These are two really good suspects. And I live in D.C. When they arrest somebody, they don't give you that kind of 10-foot stretch in back and front.
There's some indication that these police arresting them, and the police that arrest other individuals in photographs at the time, were not anybody that could be identified from the police photo books of the time as actual members of the Dallas Police Department. So it would be standard intelligence practice to have phony police clear the area and look official to take the assassins out and the teams out and make sure that they got clear of any trouble with anyone who was a real investigator or police officer who might figure out what was happening.
Okay, slide off, please. Now we'll show you some video of witnesses at the time of the assassination.
The shot came from behind the wooden fence. There's no doubt whatsoever in my mind in the statement that I made in the sheriff's office immediately after the shooting, that I made it very plain there was no doubt in my mind but there was definitely a shot fired from behind that picket fence.
The motorcycle policeman dropped his motorcycle in the street with his gun in his hand and run up the embankment to the hedge. We all four seen about the same thing as the shot. The smoke came from behind the hedge on the north side of the plaza, but it came from a fence between the book depository and the railroad track. Most everyone thought it came from the fence between the book depository and the railroad track.
And we were just in front of the triple underpass on Elm Street, and we heard the first shot, and then as the cart got directly in front of us, well, a gunshot apparently from behind us hit the president in the side of the temple.
From behind you, too?
I think it came from the same location. Apparently back up on the knoll on top of the hill, a little mound of ground there, the garden.
It was the fourth shot fired, and one of those shots came from behind that picket fence. And there's no doubt in my mind the third shot came from the fence, and it wasn't near as loud as the fourth shot or the first and second shot.
Back up on the knoll, I don't know what you call it.
Do you think the shot came from up on top of the viaduct toward the president, is that correct?
Yes, sir. Not on the viaduct itself, but up on top of the hill, a little mound of ground.
%of the witnesses that day thought the shot came from the knoll. Of the known witnesses that researchers have documented, 266 of them, the Warren Commission questioned 126. Many were not asked where they thought the shots came from. Of the ones that were asked, 32 said the Texas School Book Depository, 51 said the knoll. Of the 20 sheriffs in Dealey Plaza that day, 16 ran to the knoll at the time of the shot. This is a photo of Jean Hill. She was the closest bystander to Kennedy at the time of the headshot. She saw a gunman behind the fence, and she ran up to chase him. She was stopped by two men that identified themselves as Secret Service agents, showed her identification, and forcibly took her to a building for questioning. She was intimidated by the Warren Commission. She testified, and her testimony was altered. She was under FBI surveillance for years. She came home multiple times to find her furniture wrecked. Her children were threatened. The friend she was with, Mary Moorman, standing together, said she saw Ruby in front of the Texas School Book Depository at the time of the shooting. They heard 4 to 6 shots. Mary Moorman saw a puff of smoke and a man on the knoll, and she said at the time of the shooting, everyone was paralyzed in the plaza, but there was one individual walking briskly in front of the Texas School Book Depository, and that movement was so curious in this frozen moment that he stood out to her and she took note. And later, when she saw Jack Ruby on television after he assassinated Oswald, she identified him clearly as Ruby.
Another witness saw an individual that she later identified as Jack Ruby in the area at the base of the knoll, exiting a truck and taking what looked to be a gun and a carrying case up the back of the knoll about a half an hour before the assassination. Ruby was known that morning to have been moving furniture and doing work in the Daltex building to the rear of the shooting site, and Penn Jones, the researcher, got a picture of Ruby at the Parkland Hospital after the shooting, leaving Parkland after Kennedy arrived. And Ruby was then able to get down into the basement of the Dallas jail later on. He hung around with the press and with reporters in the jail. The famous Oswald interview where he's asked about shooting the president, Ruby's present at the back of the room. It was a constant presence throughout the situation.
Go back to that last one. S.M. Holland was standing up on top of the overpass. He was a railroad worker standing with a group of friends, and he saw a puff of smoke in the area circled here on this photo.
My thesis on the assassination is that people did in fact fire from both the book depository, sixth floor window, and from the grassy knoll, but that the important shots came from other locations, and that in many cases used silencers in order to cover the shots, and that these shots that made noise and the puffs of smoke were merely for distraction at the time, or as some sort of a backup if necessary. There were gunmen further down the route along Stemmons between here and the Trade Mart in case this particular situation for some reason had been avoided or didn't work out. There were other points at which they would have killed him. There was evidence of upwards of 16 shots. Agent Kellerman of the Secret Service, driving the car, said later to the Warren Commission it was a flurry of shots at the time in the middle of all this shooting. He said, let's get the hell out of here. As soon as Kennedy's head was hit, the car sped off. So there were fire from many locations. I think that Kennedy's reactions and the wounds fit more closely a shot from a storm sewer to the right front of the motorcade, and it's just beyond the edge of the sign you see in this picture, right about the base of the stairs going down from the grassy knoll. It's a fairly large storm sewer. I can get in and out of it, and you can even crawl through the pipes. If you go down this street going west along the storm sewer route, one pipe leads down to the river, but another section goes across underneath the knoll and comes up at the juncture behind the picket fence where it meets the railroad overpass concrete. And so someone could have taken the shot, crawled through there, climbed up a vertical pipe and come out behind the picket fence and gotten out across the knoll area. Alternately, if you crawl underneath Elm Street to the far side of the street and go left down the pipe system, which Penn Jones did, you come at the end of the pipe to a grate that leads into the basement of the Dallas jail. And so there were at least two pipe escape routes from. It's a good military location. It's totally hidden, and it's a clear shot. It's a close shot, and I think it was done with 45, perhaps an exploding shell, a large caliber shell with a silenced 45, and it lifts Kennedy up and back at over 100 miles per hour, way too fast, for it to have been the car braking or Jackie pushing him or the ridiculous things that the Warren Commission people come up with to explain the shot. So I believe that shot came from there, that the throat shot came from the umbrella man to the front, and that the back shot came from the top of one of the buildings further down Elm Street, and originated with one of the members of the Dallas Police Department who had a high-power rifle and was on the roof of the building that day. But I think there were many locations, many shots, some used and some not. And I bring this up because I didn't want to identify the sewer early on. There's too many points I would have had to interrupt to show you where it was. But you can see close to the edge, the right edge of this sign is about where the storm sewer is there on Elm Street, and would have been below and very close to the motorcade as it passed.
And another face to a person who testified and was disregarded, Lee Bowers, who was in a railroad tower up behind the knoll and saw cars moving and two men with radio phones behind the fence at the time of the assassination. A diagram locating other witnesses, including Zapruder, who said a shot came over his shoulder, Emmett Hudson, who heard shots above and behind him, Forrest Sorrells, who was in the lead car, who said a shot came from the knoll, James Tagg, the innocent bystander that was wounded, heard shots from the knoll. Many Texas School Book Depository office workers said shots came from the knoll. Officer Hargis, who led the chase up the knoll, Paul Landis, Secret Service agent, said that the last shot, the fatal headshot, came from that direction. And J.C. Price, who was on the roof of the annex building, he's number M there, saw a man run to the railroad cars after he heard the volley of shots.
This is a photograph just after, showing some of the reactions of the witnesses. The press cars are still passing at this point, just barely visible at the front of the bus, the press bus on the right side of the picture. Sitting down the street is the umbrella man and an associate who sat next to him, who in more close-up, better pictures seemed to show a radio in this individual's hand, and can't see them as well there, but they sat down, had a little conference, and then got up and walked away. A lot of people are still in confusion. People have gone up on the knoll, and this is just within a minute or so after the Kennedy car passed. This next shot, a little bit later in sequence, shows the people still walking down toward the knoll area and from across, and the very right edge of the photo shows not the person running behind the bus, but the person closest in the right foreground, is identified by many of the researchers as Jim Hicks as one of the kill team radio transmitters or operators. He appears to have a small radio in the back left pocket of his pants that's sticking out, and some of the researchers have identified him as part of the operating teams.
These are the Newmans, Bill and Gail and their two children laying on the ground. They were standing in front of Abraham Zapruder. Bill was a military man and familiar with gunfire. He said the shots came over their heads from the knoll, and he was the one who coined the phrase, the knoll. In the 3 years following the assassination, 18 material witnesses died. 6 by gunfire, 1 by slit throat, 1 by a karate chop to the throat, 3 by car accidents, including hit and run, 2 by suicide, and 5 by natural causes. The London Sunday Times said the odds for this happening were 100,000 trillion to 1. And Penn Jones has documented over the years 180 mysterious deaths of key witnesses in the case.
Also, the Newmans and others of the witnesses said that there was a distinct difference in sound between the final shot, the headshot, and the other ones that they had heard, suggesting again that the source of that shot was not at the top of the knoll.
Now you'll see a rotoscoped version of the fatal headshot, which is a close-up.
Focusing just on Kennedy's head.
With that, we'll take a break and come back for some in-depth analysis by John Judge.
Cable 10, your community television station, celebrating 10 years.